You said in the Munich Security Conference in early 2022, before the SMO was launched, they had this giddy feeling
Yeah.
that they just knew that this is it. This is time, boys. We're going to just bring Russia to its knees.
Right.
How did they miscalculate so terribly? How is that
Yeah.
possible that the miscalculation was that bad that they were just excited, not even like, oh, this is going to be a tough fight. We got to be, we got to be ready. They're just like, oh boy, let's do this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How,
Right. Yeah. And they
how did that
said they
happen?
didn't even prepare. They were so sure of their own superiority that they didn't, they knew a war was about to begin, but really didn't prepare for it. And we see this as, I find this extraordinary. We're 3 years into it, and they're being outproduced massively by the Russians. All of NATO is being outproduced in military equipment and munitions by the Russians. So they've had 3 years to reach, and they still haven't. So anyway, that's kind of a separate issue, but it's something that it shows anyway that these people are not very well grounded in reality. They kind of live in a world again of ideology, and it's an ideology that's centered on their own supremacy. And I guess that's what you have to say is that they were blinded by their own arrogance, the belief in Western exceptionalism, to the point that they didn't ever take seriously. Again, I'm sure you had honest reports coming from honest analysts in the intelligence agencies, they both in Europe but you had the people at the top that were just so sure of their own superiority that they always ignored that. And then you had the sycophants who always told the leaders what they wanted to hear, and they just listened to the sycophants. That's the only thing that made sense to them. And amazingly, even 3 years into the war, that's, I think, what we still have.
That's what I was going to ask him. Like, it's been 3 years. Why haven't we seen any scaling up of productions, or is there becoming an knowledge?
A minor scaling up, but just nothing significant. Again, at the beginning of the war, I know I've said this a few times before, but that I thought that the Russians, if they didn't achieve a quick victory, it was over. And that's because in purchasing power parity, terms, which is really the realistic way to measure an economy. If you look at the NATO economies versus Russia, it's 11-1. 11-1. I mean, the U.S. plus Europe, the total economic capacity of those countries, according to the standard statistics, from the World Bank and so on, is 11 times greater than that of Russia. So how can Russia be outproducing them? I still don't fully understand that, but they are, and they've had 3 years to gear up, and they just haven't. There has been, like an increase in shell production in the U.S., but it's still far short of what's needed, far below the Russian output.
So in the beginning, when I asked you to give me your ruling on who's at fault for this war, you said it's primarily the fault of the United States.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if it's primarily the fault of the United States. Now the United States is changing its tune. It seems like we miscalculated this whole thing, and now we realize, like, oops, Russia's a lot stronger than we thought. We're backing out. We can't handle this. But the Europeans don't want to. I don't understand. I'm really struggling. I'm really struggling with the European position, because it's like, okay, this is the fault of the United States. And then also we were lied to by the United States, essentially bought into this lie that NATO was this great military force, that our countries were forced to buy these overpriced military equipment that's been proven to be quite ineffective in a modern war. And this is what we've been sold as. We've been giving protection money to the United States, essentially. They're the big mafia boss that's promised us that we'll keep you safe and we'll do everything. And now the U.S. is kind of turning tail in a way. And this whole, you said this is largely the fault of the United States. I just don't understand why. What are the Europeans doing? Why don't they? They should be very upset with America. Right. For saying, like, you lied to us about, how great NATO was, and you started this whole thing. we're
Yeah.
upset with you. If anything, they should be running into the arms of China and Russia and
Yeah.
saying like, well, you know what, screw you, America. You know, instead they're
Yeah.
like, no, we're going to forget America. We're going to do this by ourselves. We're going to take on
Yeah.
Russia and
It's
China.
just,
Like,
yeah. Yeah. It's just absurd. It's just completely absurd. Yeah. No, it's really nutty. Again, sometimes it's hard to explain irrationality. When if somebody's behaving rationally, let's say in their own interests, it's easy to analyze, because as maybe incentives change, the behavior changes, they're responding. But it seems like not the Russians rather, but the Europeans are they're operating according to a different logic. It's not a logic of real hard interests, of hard realities. It's a logic of ideology. And I think maybe above all, a sense of moral purity. I think we got another example of that. Of course, there was the Nord Stream explosion. There's almost certain it was carried out by the U.S. That the European governments just accepted. Thank you, Master, for destroying our energy infrastructure, right? but, but then recently we had the Baltic states cut themselves off from the Russian grid, the Russian electricity grid. And this was hailed as some great victory. And it's been a disaster. I think like the largest plant in one of those countries had to close down because the electricity became too expensive. It's doubled, it's tripled. And yet it's you had Ursula von der Leyen go there and declare this as some sort of a marvelous victory against the Russians. The Russians are hardly notice. It just doesn't really affect their economies at all. Say, okay, well, we'll just have to use that electricity ourselves, and it means Russian electricity will be even a little cheaper than it already is. I know it's been argued that they were thinking that maybe by doing this they could severely damage, potentially bring about the collapse of Kaliningrad, which is the Russian exclave right there, above Poland and on the Baltic Sea there. But the Russians saw it coming, and they actually, unlike they behave very differently from the Europeans. They realized this could happen because they were tied in through that same grid that passed through the Baltics. And they realized that the Baltics cut themselves off from the grid, then Kaliningrad would be without power. So back in 2018, when they saw that, hey, this could happen someday, they began building power plants. And so when it actually happened, they were ready. They switched them on and there was no problem. And so Kaliningrad's doing fine. But the Baltic states aren't. So it just shows, it just sort of like these people, the leadership in Europe has seemed to, they kind of take their superiority for granted. Maybe this is just sort of a product of decades of being the most prosperous or one of the most prosperous parts of the world. And you begin to think that this is sort of like a God-given right. You're just, you're prosperous because you're Europeans. That's who we are. This is of our divine right. So we don't have to stop and really think about what we're doing. It was because of people in the past who actually took reality very seriously and that you became prosperous. But I think the current generation has forgotten that and has just taken it for granted. And so they don't actually, make these hard calculations. They don't really think about the consequences of their actions. There's just this assumption of superiority, and when the U.S. and Europe alongside it, let's say back in the 1990s, they were so much more powerful and prosperous than the rest of the world that they could do dumb things and they didn't suffer consequences. Or maybe there was consequences, but there was such a, let's say, a large, they had so much excess wealth and excess power, they lost some of it, they hardly noticed it. But I think we've gone past that, and now they are seeing the consequences, but but the thinking hasn't caught up. They haven't actually started to ground themselves in reality again. It's just like this. I think that sense of superiority that came out of a long period of prosperity and peace um, is still there, and they still cling on to it. And it's eventually it's going to have to collapse. It's not sustainable. It's like this balloon that they're floating on is going to pop. It's going to come down. But they clearly haven't abandoned the thinking. The let's call it the unipolar or hegemonic thinking, exceptionalist thinking.
So you think that their thinking is that they were so prosperous because they were under American hegemony, that they attribute their prosperity and their wealth to the unipolar moment? Is that largely what it is?
Back there
is
were
there any
all,
truth to that?
Yeah. Well, there was some. I mean, obviously, like the relationship with the U.S. was very important to Europe as it rebuilt after World War II, and America was at that time, like in 1945, was by far the most prosperous and powerful country in the world. Maybe when you're talking about military power, it had a rival in the Soviet Union, but prosperous, most definitely, and by far. And so, yeah, it made a lot of sense, at least economic sense, to hitch your wagon to the American horse. But eventually the Europeans caught up. Germany, in particular, became a real economic powerhouse. There was the German economic miracle of the 1960s that kind of paralleled the Japanese miracle, But so anyway, they eventually, over time, they began to outsource their foreign policy thinking to the U.S. and they were all one. Now it's a very strange. I don't think that anybody foresaw it, but um, I yeah, now they think they can go on for it. Maybe you certainly did have people arguing that it was important. That was the typical establishment, especially kind of like the center-right version of things. I'll give you an example. Is Merz, the current chancellor of Germany. He's, the head of a center-right party, and he was always very, very pro-American. And he was a businessman at one time too. And I think that was part of the view. Yeah, our prosperity is tied to America. So yeah, you would think that, well, whoops, we can't rely on America anymore. They're talking about putting 25% tariffs on us. So maybe, well, what are Europe's options? Well, this could be the time to consider multipolarity. That would actually be very good for Europe. They say, okay, we can't put all our eggs in one basket. That's what we're doing with America. And now look where we are. Okay, we don't have to be pro-Russian or pro-Chinese, but we can improve our relations with these other powers. And then Europe, that strengthens Europe. It gives Europe more options. If we can, nobody can take us for granted the way that the U.S. clearly did, because they know we have options. In a multipolar world, the smart strategy is actually to kind of to balance your relationships and increase the number of your connections. That would be the rational response. But these are just not rational people. So even, Merz, who saw the importance and believed in maintaining the business relationships, economic relationships with the U.S., he's now saying openly that we should just kind of go it alone, which is crazy. So what is he talking about? Okay, you're going to, it's just going to be Europe is going to become the hermit kingdom, or, it's just, I don't know, it's just going to be Europe against the rest of the world. That's just not going to work out very well for them.
Yeah, it can't last. It seems
I don't
like
think so. Right.
The inevitable outcome is that these governments will be voted out of office. They'll be overthrown. There'll be something.
Yeah, well, but of course we see they're fighting that. That's the thing. The most recent example and the most egregious example, of course, is what's going on in Romania now. So that's the danger, is that there could be this very sharp turn to authoritarianism, where rather than just playing sort of dirty tricks and maybe just keeping barely within the letter of the law to keep certain parties out of power, you just disregard the norms of democracy entirely and just ban parties that you don't like. But that may be, that's certainly what we're seeing in Romania. I think there's just no doubt about it. And it could spread to other countries. It's again, there's talk about banning the off day, and there's efforts to, lawfare is being used against Marine Le Pen and so on and so forth. And it could, if you look at the trend, just over the course of the last couple of decades, there has been an obvious trend towards authoritarianism, an obvious shift away from, an honest belief in democracy and support for real democratic institutions and real alternatives, towards what we're seeing now, which is, I think, the beginnings of authoritarianism.
Let me let Doge out real quick because
okay, not a problem.
They just got back.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, well, that's terrifying. I really hope that doesn't happen. I love Europe. It's such a great place to go.
I do too. I find it very painful to watch what's going on in Europe and particularly in the UK. I've always had a fondness. I've loved British literature, and it's painful to see what's happening in these countries now. And I do hope for the best. I hope that they can come back. You never can really come back, but that they can they can at least maintain some of the that they're not completely, they don't fall into the abyss. I mean, that's what I'm saying. No, I don't know, but I worry that they just might.
Yeah.
And it can happen. Most of the threat is what you would call, I don't even think it's right to call it leftist, but just sort of a liberal establishment, which is really a globalist establishment, and which is sort of, maybe you may say that it's on the left side of the spectrum, but I think that can be argued whether it really is. So, the challenges are, in general, with some exceptions that we've talked about, is from the populist right. And I think there's reasons to be encouraged with that. And I find, in general, I support them. And probably most of those countries, I'd probably vote for the populist right. But there is a danger, especially if the establishment goes down a hard authoritarian road, that the populist right may become authoritarian in response. I mean, that's something could happen, and that we may end up having, rather than having the issue, resolved democratically and peacefully, that we'll see, maybe real civil war and dictators of different stripes. I'm just speculating. This may be decades in the future. Maybe it never will happen. But I think there's reasons to be nervous about it right now. Again, because of I don't think you can downplay what's happening in Romania. That is really alarming, and it is a very clear turn towards authoritarianism that is supported, by Brussels. It's just there's no condemnation of it from Brussels, but only murmurings of support, and they probably almost certainly were actively involved in it.
It's so hard to believe that the West is we're always about freedom and democracy, and it's just a lie. It's our version of freedom and democracy only. It's how they define it. It's scary. We'll see how it turns out. It's something that I think is just really just kind of extra crappy about the whole America unipolar moment for us as Americans, is that we never really got anything out of the American empire as American people. Yeah. It's like when we didn't share in the spoils of the American empire. When an empire is committing evil and illegal acts, you're usually doing it because you're getting something. Like you go like, oh, I robbed this guy, took it, I got all of his money. Well, that was wrong and evil. but there's money, there's something there, some
Right.
wealth. But
Right.
here it's just like we just want evil and we got nothing out of it.
Yeah.
And what we got is a huge amount of debt, $36 trillion worth of debt, and a really broken and divided society,
Yeah.
and kind of just a massive national identity crisis. It just kind of just broke everything.
Yeah.
We didn't
Yeah.
get.
I agree completely. There's no benefit. I mean, there are attempts. The benefits were not for the people of America, or even for the American nation. The benefits of these wars, for example, in Iraq, were to certain well-connected, corporations, in general to the MIC, but not to the American people. Yeah, no, we suffered a loss. It's just an unequivocal loss. There's
Right.
no other way of looking at it. A huge
It just
loss.
seems like on every level, just American society, American wealth, yeah, like I said, American identity itself, just all of it has just been kind of destroyed, or at least severely damaged.
Yes.
And so, I don't know, is there a way out for it? I mean, we're all doom and gloom. It's Friday,
Well,
the weekend's
no,
coming
yeah.
around. We got
No, well, actually, we've ended some of the recent programs on a positive note because, whatever you say about Trump, and actually, I would say that Trump is sort of like the old style imperialist that you were talking about. That explains his behavior, vis-a-vis Greenland and Panama and Ukraine. Right. He's just like, hey, we're going to get some money out of this. I think that's right. He was looking, this is stupid. What is this war in Iraq doing? It's a bunch of people die and we spend $1 trillion or $2 or $3 trillion. What's this all about? I want to get something. He bragged about stealing the oil, after some attempts actually to withdraw from Syria, but he bragged about actually stealing the oil. That's something we get. This is one thing that's consistent in Trump's thinking, I think, is this old style imperialism, which, again, as we've said, is ugly. Sometimes it can be just criminal, but it is real. And maybe that's, again, this is not going to be. I would love that we would just make a 180-degree turn and we go back to a saner period of time and we would jettison all, the institutions and ideologies that have led us down this wrong path. And, we just make a clean break and start anew and be kind of like we would go back to being a republic, not an empire. It's not going to be that simple. I mean, you can see that under Trump. It's going to be a long journey, and there are going to be all kinds of. We're entering this stage. I don't know how successful Trump will be in this of returning to that old style imperialism. I would say that all in all, it really is an improvement, even though it's nothing that I'm really happy with. But it can be hopefully just like a first step in a journey to sanity, because it is actually, in some ways, it is more sane than what we had before.
Guys, thanks for listening. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And if you haven't checked it out yet, please check out my website, nobliski.io. You can look at the pinned comment below. It's something that I think you'll find useful. Even my dad uses it. My wife uses it. Instead of Googling things, you should be using this website because you get access to OpenAI, Perplexity, Anthropic, DeepSeek. There's hundreds of models that you can use. It's what I use to create the thumbnail images, things like this. And the greatest thing about it is there's no rate limits. There are no subscription fees. It's free to try out and use. You get free tokens every day. So if you're not a heavy AI user, you will never have to pay for anything. But this is really my passion project. I really want to get it off the ground, and I think you guys would like it. So yeah, check it out. Let me know what you think. And if you have time to download the apps and give it 5 stars, that'd mean a lot to me as well. Thanks a lot.